Can we give, now that she's back, a quick round of applause to Andrew Sturck, who's really the person. About a year ago, a little longer, said, let's do this and see how it goes, and it's gone wonderfully. Thanks to all of your hard work, but also to her for leading the way. So thank you. And now one final panel.
Hi everyone, welcome to our final panel, War and its Aftermath in the 20th Century. I'm very excited to be moderating it and now to be presenting our last three speakers, starting with Hannah Kiresuk, who is a third-year student of history, minoring in Russian language and the history of science, technology, and medicine. For her undergraduate thesis on World War I prisoners of war from New Zealand, Hannah was awarded the 2025 Hedley Donovan Scholarship, and she spent significant time doing independent research abroad. She'll be graduating with her BA in December, and she's looking forward to starting an MA program in history at Victoria University of Wellington in February 2027. Before her grad school adventures, however, Hannah is excited to spend her last summer as an undergraduate in the UK studying history and literature at Oxford University. Following Hannah, we have a presentation from Matthew Smeaton, who is a senior undergraduate student currently pursuing a double major in history and in political science. Born and raised here in the Twin Cities, after graduation, Matthew will be attending the Hubert Humphrey School of Public Affairs to attain a master's in public policy. He has a keen interest in the history of the Second World War, which forms the foundation of the thesis that he's going to present from. In his free time, Matthew enjoys writing, playing music, and hunting for Lake Superior agates. Ryken Farr, our third and final speaker for today, has spent his time as an undergraduate focusing his studies on Jewish history, including working with local Jewish stories and the stories of displaced Holocaust survivors. His research was awarded with the Hedley Donovan Scholarship as well as the Steiner Program Fellowship from the Yiddish Book Center. Ryken plans to develop the research he conducted for this thesis towards a dissertation in the long-term future. This coming fall, he will begin a dual master's degree program at New York University and Long Island University, specializing in archives and public history, as well as library and information science. Thank you.
It's the top, the big button at that, nope, on the front of the panel. One more up, there you go. There you go.
All right, let's see if this works. Awesome. Okay, so
if you want to put it actually on, it should sit in the right spot.
We'll do this. I think this is great. Thank you so much. Hi everyone. Like what was just mentioned, my name is Hannah Kiresuk, and I am a third-year history student with a deep love for New Zealand. Today I'll be speaking about New Zealand's World War I prisoners of war, particularly of the Gallipoli campaign. I was first connected to this story when, on a brief working holiday before starting university in 2023, on Anzac Day in 2023, I found myself participating in several local Anzac Day services. I carried this experience with me into my undergrad when I started working with my advisor, Dr. Yvonne Roberts, in the fall of my sophomore year. I have since spent nearly 2 years on this project, including a summer abroad conducting research in Europe and New Zealand, funded by the Donovan Scholarship. Before I get into deep, however, I wanted to define a few terms related to my work, the first being that of Anzac. Anzac stands for Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. The term was first used during World War I, which is the conflict I'm discussing. As members of the British Commonwealth, both Australia and New Zealand fought together under this banner. Yet what I noticed immediately in my research is that there's been significantly more material produced related to Australian World War I prisoners of war than there has been to New Zealand. For context of New Zealand, during World War I, approximately 100,000 men, or nearly 10% of its total population at the time, was sent abroad to fight in this global conflict, where it suffered around 18,000 casualties. In addition to its dead, New Zealand also lost men to capture. An approximate 503 New Zealand men were captured during World War I, 63 of whom died during captivity. The surviving 440 can be again further reduced to just the Gallipoli campaign, where an estimated 36 men were taken prisoner by the then Ottoman Empire. The second term I would like to place in context is that referring to the Gallipoli campaign. This was a military offensive that took place in the Gallipoli Peninsula on the coast of present-day Turkey. Allied troops landed on the peninsula on April 25, 1915, with the intent to seize the Dardanelles Strait and push the Ottomans out of the war. As you can see from this photo, Gallipoli's geography made it particularly challenging for troops to advance. As the invading force, Anzac troops first needed to dig trenches and establish camps. Once these facilities were erected, the challenge of getting food, supplies, and fresh water to the front lines cannot be overstated. In addition, both trenches and camps suffered from a lack of sanitation, resulting in widespread infectious diseases such as dysentery. The end result was a campaign that failed spectacularly. In fact, the most successful performance on the part of the Allies being its retreat in 1916. Within the Gallipoli campaign was also the August Offensive from 6 to 29 August 1915. This was an elaborate plan to capture two high points on the peninsula, Hill 971 and Chunuk Bair, as shown in these maps. Chunuk Bair was particularly valuable to the Allies as it provided troops with sweeping views of the peninsula. The New Zealand battle for Chunuk Bair had a large death toll, where nearly 90% of men died in combat. Most of these deaths occurred on the invasion date on August 8, 1915, when the Wellington Battalion, made up of 760 men, was sent up to the mountain. While they were initially successful in this capture, they became overwhelmed while waiting for reinforcements. By the time that night fell, only 70 were left standing. It was during this offensive that the majority of New Zealand men were taken prisoner. For instance, of the 36 men captured on Gallipoli, 21 were apprehended during the battle for Chunuk Bair. I will use the remaining time to discuss the stories of two of these men, John Forrester and George McEnany, using their NZEF statements. Forrester and McEnany, along with all the other surviving New Zealand prisoners of war, gave testimony after the fact of their time captive to the New Zealand Expeditionary Force, or the NZEF. The NZEF collected statements separate for prisoners of the Ottoman than for those of the Western Front. For prisoners of the Ottomans, their statements were collected individually in Cairo, Egypt, when former prisoners were handed this list of typed questions and a blank stack of paper. They were instructed to respond in essay format. This is a photo of the first page of questions, and along with question 13, which asks directly about medical care in captivity. This will become especially important later on in my presentation. Though my paper used outside sources, what I'm discussing here today, all the quotes were found in these NZEF statements. This method of questioning provided historians with an extremely detailed account of captivity, and as each and every returned prisoner gave a statement, this document set is also unique in its completion. It is worth mentioning the quality of writing found in these statements, as with limited exception, these men were little older than teenagers. They hailed from rural communities on New Zealand's South Island, where they were employed as laborers on family farms or as clerks in family-run businesses. They had less than the equivalent of a high school education, yet they wrote with the breadth of an experienced author, owing to the extreme circumstances of their captivity. The first prisoner I will discuss is John Forrester. Forrester was taken prisoner by the Ottoman forces during the Battle for Chunuk Bair on August 8, 1915, after having suffered wounds to his left shoulder and right hand. As he described his arrival to Chunuk Bair, "We got in the night of the 8th and advanced under cover of darkness. We got up well on the hill and were told to dig in. About 1 o'clock in the morning, the enemy was seen massing up our front. They were preparing to rush our trenches, which were not very deep down at that time owing to the rocky nature of the ground." Forrester was one of 2 men captured during this exchange. Of his capture, he wrote that one of the Turks presented his rifle to shoot us, but a Turkish sergeant who was in charge prevented him from firing upon us. They were very rough to us and in a great hurry to get us away to their lines. As a prisoner, Forrester was not well received in Ottoman trenches. As he wrote again in his NZEF statement, "While passing through the enemy lines, most of the Turkish soldiers did not seem to like us being taken prisoner. Some would spit on us, some would give us a punch or a push to one side. Some of them drew their hands across their throat to show what they thought should be done with us." After a brief medical evaluation, Forrester was moved from the mountain to the coast. The march took him nearly 24 hours to complete. At the coast, Forrester describes a scene of chaos. "I was about 10 days in the field hospital here, laying under the trees around the hospital. There was close to 3,000 Turkish wounded. There was only about 2 doctors and 4 or 5 Armenian dressers. Some of the wounded could not be dressed for 4 or 5 days, and many of the Turks died there for lack of treatment, while many men got maggots in their wounds from want of dressing." Forrester was next moved aboard a ship and transported to Constantinople. Upon arriving in Constantinople, Forrester was admitted to hospital, where he again wrote of poor conditions. "I lay on the floor for a week with no bedding. 3 of us were then given an old mattress and one an old blanket between us. The windows were boarded up halfway to keep us from seeing outside. After enduring these conditions for 3 weeks, Forrester asked to leave the hospital despite still having active wounds. He was next taken to prison, also in poor condition. As he wrote, "I lay on the floor where there was no bedding of any sort. All of us were covered in vermin. I was lucky to be in that filthy place for only 1 week." He was then moved to Angora, and in Angora, Forrester was kept in an old schoolhouse, where he and the other prisoners were held inside for up to 23 hours a day. He again wrote of poor rations and was again moved after 3 weeks, this time on foot and for nearly 100 miles to a different prison camp on the other side of the Ottoman Empire. At this point, it is January 1916. The Allies had just retreated off Gallipoli, and the Ottoman attitude skyrocketed. Despite his long march, Forrester and the other POWs were almost immediately ordered to march back to Angora, now in the dead of winter and through knee-deep snow. Forrester spent the remainder of his time prisoner being moved between hospitals and work sites in Constantinople and Afyonkara Hisar. The later location is where the rest of our story takes place. George McEnany was also captured on 8 August 1915, but separate from Forrester. He endured the same mistreatment, injuries, and transport, and eventually also found himself at Afyonkara Hisar prison camp. He describes life at this camp in detail, its filthy conditions, its neglectful rations, its daily beatings, and its overcrowded and unsanitary nature. He wrote of the death he saw, of a graveyard so full of bodies they were stacked on top of each other, in shallow graves and with limbs sticking out from the ground. He wrote of supplies so scarce the dead were buried without cloth wrappings or clothing. He wrote of conditions so desperate that if a fellow prisoner was mistakenly entombed in cloth, he and the others were ordered to exhume it from its corpse. Yet even from these descriptions, it was the allegations of medical abuse that were most alarming. In his response to question 13, prisoners held at Afyonkara Hisar held little back regarding the trauma they endured. Both Forrester and McEnany singled out Afyonkara Hisar as the most challenging location for them as prisoners, particularly in terms of medical care. Their need for medical care here, in itself not surprising, a combination of injury during capture, forced labor, overcrowded conditions, poor sanitation, and inadequate nutrition, created a cycle of hospitalization and death. The camp hospital was overrun with inmates, a large portion of whom enduring the final stages of dysentery. Lacking doctors and orderlies, these men were left to die where they lay, a slow and painful process of dehydration and fever. Within the words of Forrester, McEnany, and 2 other prisoners of war held in this location, there is clear evidence of lethal injection. This finding was unexpected, being that the use of lethal injection is not seen in the historiography of World War I, and being that the narrative of the Allied prisoner of war has been so established outside of the New Zealand context. Yet in each of these 4 accounts, prisoners of war who were suffering from dysentery were given injections and would subsequently die a few hours later. As Jordan Forrester testified, many of our men who suffered from dysentery got too weak to help themselves. They were given an injection of some sort. These men died within 12 hours. George McEnany testified, when a man got too weak to help himself, the doctors gave him an injection, after which they would inevitably die. In addition to this testimony, I found similar evidence from Indian prisoners of war held in the same location. While the evidence is clear, the motivations of Ottoman doctors remains questionable. It would be easy to simply label Ottoman guards as cruel and unjust without considering the complexities of this history. And thus, my time remaining, I cannot debate intent or meaning. Instead, what is known is the importance of this finding, both within this field already so established and already so well known, and in the historiography of lethal injection. In our complex and changing world, overlooking this evidence would be a profound mistake. On today, the 25th of April, and the 111th anniversary of the Allied landing at Gallipoli, it feels especially important that New Zealand voices are heard. Pictured here is the New Zealand Memorial to the Missing. It is located at the Gallipoli Peninsula near the battlefields of Chunukbar. On the memorial are the names of 849 New Zealand men who died in this battle that have no known grave. It is important to note that on this memorial and the ones that I previously showed in my slides, the names of POWs are not featured amongst the names of the confirmed dead. In this way, I argue that prisoners of war form a form of unresolved grief. Their absence reflects a hope and a wish for their sons and for their husbands that they might still be alive, perhaps in a camp somewhere, perhaps between Angora and Constantinople. To end on a interesting note, if you're looking for a good summer read regarding New Zealand's contributions to the Gallipoli campaign, might I recommend Christopher Pugsley's Gallipoli, the New Zealand Story, Or if you would rather learn more about the spirit of the Anzac on Anzac Day, The Anzac Experience by the same author is another great read. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Matthew Smeaton, and this is my project, Operation Dragoon, the contested legacy of a forgotten invasion. To start us off, these pictures were taken on the French coast in 1944. Just shout out, what event are they depicting? Anybody?
Yay.
D-Day? You're wrong. This is actually Operation Dragoon, which was an amphibious assault of France in 1944 on August 15th. I had not heard of it either, and I'm a World War II nerd, so it's very unusual. So I started with the question, why don't we remember Operation Dragoon like we remember D-Day? Or technically Overlord. Let's begin with some historical background information. By traditional accounts, the Second World War broke out in September of 1939 after the German invasion of Poland. In response to this aggression, the United Kingdom and France declared war on Germany, but in June of 1940, France was overrun and surrendered to the Nazi regime. It was then up to the United Kingdom and its Commonwealth both to defeat Germany and also to liberate the French ally. In 1941, the war expanded in two critical ways. First, Germany declared war on the Soviet Union in June 22nd and invaded during Operation Barbarossa. Secondly, the Japanese attacked the United States by launching a surprise strike on the Pacific Fleet stationed in Pearl Harbor. Can anybody tell me this day which will live in infamy?
December 7th.
Exactly. It wasn't a trick question this time. This brought two new major powers into the war against the Axis. But in order to win the war, the Allied powers would have to cooperate and coordinate their war efforts. The United States, United Kingdom, and its colonies worked together on several fronts, including Northern Africa and then the invasion of Italy. On this map, you can see the locations of some naval invasions, first targeting Axis-held Northern Africa, and then later the Italian peninsula. These amphibious assaults were a training ground to learn the logistical and tactical lessons that would be put to use later in Operation Dragoon. To work together with the Soviet Union, the big three powers, or the Soviet Union, the United States, and the United Kingdom, held several meetings to discuss plans and coordinate the war effort. The Soviet Union faced the brunt of Germany's military strength, and during 1941 and 42, they were in pretty dire straits. This map shows the extent of the Axis invasion. As you can see, the Soviets had lost major cities such as Kiev and Sevastopol. And at the peak of German occupation, Leningrad and even Moscow were in danger of being captured. By the time of the Cairo and Tehran conferences of 1943, the situation was a little bit less drastic, but Stalin still wanted the British and Americans to open a new second front that would draw German forces away from the Eastern or Soviet front. At these meetings, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill agreed that in 1944 there would be two simultaneous supreme operations that would take precedent over all other war operations. One invasion would target northern France in the Normandy area, and the other southern France in the Riviera region. The first was called Operation Overlord, and is commonly referred to as D-Day. The other was called Operation Anvil. This was later renamed to Operation Dragoon. Here's a map that shows these invasions. Operation Overlord started on June 6th of 1944. Despite significant casualties, American, British, and Canadian soldiers secured a foothold in mainland Europe. Although at first they faced slow progress inland, they succeeded in landing about 155,000 soldiers on the first day of the invasion. We're probably all pretty familiar with the story. It's been told and retold a million different ways in books and movies. I think there's even an Overlord movie that has zombies in it for some reason. We're probably not as familiar with how things went in the South. On August 15th, about 94,000 American troops landed with very few casualties. They rapidly began liberating French territory. The French participated too, landing one day later and managing to liberate ahead of schedule 2 major ports on the Mediterranean coast that would prove vital in supplying the Allied forces in Europe. One of these ports, Marseille, can be seen here, and Toulon is nearby. These accomplishments are rarely considered in the modern accounts of the war. So we return to my question, why is Overlord remembered in a way that Dragoon is not? I read and analyzed some historical accounts, articles about the operation, and American newspaper reporting contemporary to the invasion to find out why. Through my research, I learned that there were many factors that contributed to Dragoon's obscurity. I also learned that Dragoon is remembered in some contexts, but these contexts usually are critical of the operation. This means that Dragoon is both often not remembered, but also sometimes misremembered. There were circumstances before, during, and after the invasion that led to this result, but most critical was the post-war reframing of the operation that led to an unfair historical consensus. This diminished the perceptual significance of the operation. That's a bummer. In fact, it's a historical injustice for several reasons. It relies on fundamentally ahistoric assumptions of what was plausible at the point of the war in 1944. It diminishes the meaning of the sacrifices of soldiers that made sacrifices during the campaign, and it ignores French autonomy in the liberation of their homeland. Before the invasion launched, the Allied powers who executed it were in disagreement over what course of action to take. Winston Churchill and the United Kingdom favored a continued Italian campaign combined with diplomatic and military efforts to strengthen their position in the Mediterranean, such as the invasion of Rhodes and the convincing Turkey to join on the side of the Allies. Churchill also pushed for an invasion of the Balkans and Ljubljana, right up there, but I'll come back to that later. The United States, on the other hand, favored a much more straightforward confrontation. They would draw forces from Italy and land straight into France. Although the conferences with Stalin had established the United States' plan as one of the 2 supreme operations of 1944, Churchill and the British did what they could to cancel or at least postpone this operation. They did succeed in delaying the operation, but they could not stop it entirely. This unresolved conflict strained the relationship between the 2 Allied powers and set the stage for future clashes and ultimately the forgetting of Dragoon. During the operation, the news media reported widely on its developments, although in some ways it was overshadowed by the older and larger Overlord campaign in the north. Here are 2 examples of front-page reporting on the invasion. As you can see, Dragoon sometimes had to share headlines with other news. In the days after August 15th, fighting in France, both on the Overlord and Dragoon fronts, were often described simultaneously in single articles. This allowed actions in the south to be subsumed under the umbrella of Overlord. It isn't that surprising that Dragoon is a little bit underrepresented, as it happened after Overlord, and the landing involved many fewer casualties. That said, it would be inaccurate to say that Dragoon was not reported on. Given the attention that Dragoon received, an informed public would have been made aware of the fighting on both fronts in France, and therefore, this is not a main cause of our historical misconceptions. After the war, the memory of Dragoon has faced some pretty harsh treatment. Both immediately after Dragoon and in his post-war accounts, Winston Churchill lambasted the operation as a missed opportunity. Instead, he advocated for and bemoaned the rejection of his Ljubljana Gap strategy. Here's a map with some modern borders, and it can roughly show his rather questionable plan. It would have involved a partisan-assisted landing on the Istrian Peninsula here, a push for the Ljubljana mountain gap right in here, and then a race to Vienna. Capturing Vienna would prevent further Soviet political expansion into Eastern Europe, which was one of his primary motives. There's simply too many reasons to explain why this plan wouldn't have worked, even if I had all 13 minutes just to talk about that. But the important thing to know is that this plan was not based on reasonable strategic assumptions. Despite this conflict, Churchill succeeded in turning historical opinion against Dragoon. And while the misremembering of Dragoon is often a British phenomenon, other accounts also make the same mistake. Many sources examine Dragoon not as a mission a successful mission critical to ending the war, but rather as a foolish distraction from that precluded a Balkans excursion or a more robust Italian campaign. This is why I consider the time after the operation's execution as the most important period in forgetting and misremembering Dragoon. The strategy conflicts before the invasion were a factor in forgetting and created the potential for post-war disagreements, but they did not directly cause the issues with Dragoon's memory. Even less significant for our forgetfulness was contemporary reporting. When I started my research, I thought that the newspaper record would show that Dragoon was barely reported on and the public just never really learned about it. I was surprised to see enough content across the headlines to inform any engaged audience. Instead, it was the post-war efforts to diminish the operation that made the most impact. This guy, Winston Churchill. If you assign any one person the lion's share of the blame for this historical error, I would say it'd be Churchill. But ultimately, we come to a question. So what? Like, who cares? Does it really matter if Dragoon is remembered properly or even remembered at all? Yeah, I'd say it matters quite a bit. We need to remember the past accurately to avoid repeating mistakes. And it's the duty of historians to recount the past with as little bias as possible. The main critiques of Dragoon are simply unfounded. In southern France, the Allies liberated land much more quickly than they did during most of the slow and costly Italian campaign, meaning that the move from Italy was a good idea. Churchill's Ljubljana Gap strategy was honestly just doomed from the start, and if the Allies had attempted it, it probably would have prolonged the war. This means that the decision to go with Dragoon was the right move and wasn't some kind of missed opportunity. I think that it's high time that we reevaluate the merits of Operation Dragoon. We have forgotten the operation because it doesn't really feel particularly worthy of remembrance. But in reality, Dragoon was an exceptional victory. The mission was highly successful, and to deny that can diminish the sacrifices of the people who made it succeed. Dragoon hastened the end of the war, which saved civilian and soldier lives across Europe. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, Operation Dragoon allowed the French to participate in the liberation of their homeland. That counteracts the false narrative surrounding the Second World War that the French simply gave up in the face of Nazi aggression. To conclude, I'd like to return to these images. A short while ago, we didn't know what this event was. Definitely not. But we can now identify what this operation was, why it has been forgotten, and hopefully, why it's important that we remember it. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, especially the faces that have been here all day. Thanks for sticking it out with us. We really appreciate it. History nerds being able to nerd out about history to an audience is really, really something special. So thank you very much. Just make sure this is working. There we go. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Ryken Farr, and today I'm going to be discussing some historical and cultural implications of letsen khurbn between 1946 and 1948. So letsen khurbn was a Yiddish language journal that was published between 1946 and 1948 in American-occupied Munich by an organization called the Central Historical Commission. And you'll notice that I say American-occupied Munich because this is in the immediate post-World War II period after the defeat of the Nazis when Germany was split up amongst the big four Allied powers. And Munich was a hub in the American zone in the southeast of the country. The journal was published by editors that had lots of different identities to who they were. First and foremost, they were DPs or displaced persons. They were folks who had been displaced from their countries because of the war. They were Jews and Holocaust survivors, which was usually the largest reason why they were displaced. Many of them had been sent to concentration camps and ended up in Germany at the end of the war. Many of them had come from other countries to Germany, and especially to this American zone of Germany, seeing it as a way to possibly emigrate to a new country or even to the United States. And it was this American occupation of this section of Germany that made it possible for this Central Historical Commission to exist, which was set up by displaced Jews to start reckoning with their history of the Holocaust and publish on it, as I'll talk about a little bit further here. So the journal is very significant for many reasons, the main one of which is that it was published in Yiddish typeface. In this post-war period, much of the Hebrew typeface in Germany had been melted down during the reign of the Nazis, and so this page is not actually in Yiddish type, but you will see pages in the presentation that are. And it was very significant. It showed this agency, this drive, and I wanted to highlight some of these elements of the journal in my project. So the journal is known. It's not a new source. Historians have been citing from it for decades now in displaced scholarship. However, while it's often cited, it's rarely itself explored. Content is pulled from it. But I wanted to shine a light on it in my paper and talk about not only why it's interesting to me and important, but also how it itself can comment on the Jewish displaced Holocaust survivor experience. So starting with a typical edition of the journal, it included articles and testimonies written by displaced Holocaust survivors. So this was the first journal where testimonies were collected by survivors in this zone of Germany. They were printed, they were published in this journal for other DPs and anyone who was interested in the area to read. They also included archival presentation. So the Historical Commission behind this journal, their main mission was to compile and collect data and sources relating to the Holocaust and to Nazi oppression. And this journal gave them an opportunity to publish some of their findings. And these were anything from songs and poems written by survivors during their time in the Holocaust, to Third Reich documents that had been compiled and collected by the Commission. Those actually appeared in Yiddish translation in the journal, one of the ways it aimed to educate its readers, and then photos as well, that may have been taken by survivors themselves, or again found in this post-war period. It was also a way for the Commission to talk about itself. It talked about its goals, it talked about its actions, and most importantly, it talked about its mission. It kept itself honest to its readership, but there are constant calls throughout all the editions for the readers themselves to donate materials, to submit their stories, to submit their photos, their poems, etc. Not only to the Commission, but possibly to be included in the journal as well. And so this is one of the reasons why I think the journal itself is impactful, because it shows that there was an agency to these displaced persons, that the editors behind the journal wanted to tell their stories, but that the survivors themselves donating materials also wanted to have their stories told and share them with the public. And it was also kind of a mouthpiece for the Commission and their larger work in the period. We can also see some elements of DP life in the publishing of the journal. Not much is known. I wasn't able to find the most sources on this, but we can gather details about logistical issues behind the publishing. As I mentioned, it was printed in Hebrew or Yiddish typeface, and so I was able to find some correspondence discussing how this was procured, how paper was procured. Again, this was a period of relative kind of administrative bureaucratic chaos in the country, and so being able to find the materials to print this journal was significant in and of itself. And then there are also boilerplate questions that we can answer through this kind of background of the journal. This up here is a piece of correspondence that you can see was written from the Central Committee of Liberated Jews, which was the umbrella organization over that historical commission. And they are writing to the city of Frankfurt, the Jewish community in Frankfurt, saying that they will send 100 editions of the journal to them for 4 marks apiece. So we can start to kind of see some of the cost in the background in this journal. I don't know how much it might have cost for an average person on the street to pick up, if it cost anything, but some of these background ideas into what it meant to be not only a Jewish displaced person, but someone who wanted to take the initiative to start a journal like this can be seen through the journal itself. Another kind of crossroads that I found while I was doing my research that was interesting was that von Letsen khurbn and the efforts of the Commission were not unique up to this point in Jewish history. This could be seen as somewhat, it's maybe a claim to make it a growing tradition, now that I'm reading back what I'm writing. But it was interesting to read about how, especially around the First World War, and the pogrom history in Eastern Europe, with Jews being expelled from the Russian Empire, that Jewish historians were starting to think about Jewish tragedy, how it impacted Jewish culture moving forward, and wanting to collect and record documents to keep these memories alive. And so one of the main historians that I found was Elias Cherakover. He was active during World War I, again trying to collect and record stories of pogroms in Eastern Europe, stories of Jewish experience during World War I, and he was publishing on them. And so, similar to the journal itself, Cherakover published pieces that related to Jewish experience. He called on survivors to give their testimony. There are posters from the organizations that he worked with that, again, send out this public call, and that was something that the commission did as well. And so it was interesting to see, maybe not a direct connection yet, but kind of parallels and maybe echoes. Even in a 35-page paper, this topic was too big to cover it in its entirety, but it's a connection that I'd like to continue drawing in maybe a longer form edition and piece on this topic. And then finally, I want to talk about Vom letzten khurbn as a Yiddish publication. It's another area in which I think it can comment on the Jewish DP experience. Not only was Vom letzten khurbn published in Yiddish, but it was also included cultural changes that had happened during the Holocaust. So a lot of new terms, a lot of new words and phrases had emerged during the Holocaust in Yiddish to try and reckon with what was happening and with the now displaced persons, the Jewish experience. And so Vom letzten khurbn offered a space for those new inclusions to exist. One of the main editors for the journal, Israel Kaplan, he had a personal interest in this change of language, and so during the Holocaust, his own experience, he kept notes on new words and new phrases that emerged. And so in the first two editions of the journal, as you see published here, under a section titled Dem Volksmäuel in Nazi-Klem, he published some of these new words, and he would list them, he would define them, and say where they came from, or where he had heard them. And so not only did the journal offer space for more niche topics like this, but being a post-war Yiddish publication, the words that were created appeared in the testimonies that were given and in the articles that were published, just because it was using this new vernacular of Yiddish at the time. And so all of these reasons are to say why I believe that studying this journal for itself as a source is interesting to me, but also interesting to the literature, because I feel that it can comment on the Jewish displaced experience in Germany, especially behind the scenes. It comments on how the Holocaust was starting to be thought of in this period, very early after the war, and it can comment on the ongoing Yiddish cultural changes that happened during the Holocaust and immediately after. Thank you.
Thank you to our three speakers for these wonderful presentations, and we have now time for questions.
Ryken, you mentioned the other scholarship that was citing this source. What sort of things was it generally cited for, and what sort of information have scholars been getting from it?
Yeah, so it's pulling from some of the sections itself. And so because so much of the content of each journal were these direct first-person testimonials on the Holocaust, it's often used to just bring up like first-person accounts of the Holocaust when writing about experiences and things like that. Because the DPs that were appearing in Germany at this time were coming from around Europe, there were a variety of different Holocaust experiences that were included in that testimony, from Lithuanian experiences, Far Eastern Europe, to some like more in Poland as well. And so when a lot of scholars are looking for some of that firsthand testimony, they go to the journal. One of the books that I used actually was published on this change in Yiddish that I mentioned on the last slide, Occupied Words, by Hannah Poland-Galai, who was just here on campus actually. She's really awesome. And so she drew from the journal a bit for some of those sections on Israel Kaplan, and then I pulled from some of that as well for my paper. But yeah, I wasn't finding like a cohesive piece that kind of put the journal in the spotlight, and I thought it deserved it, and it could comment on some of the other things.
I have a question for you, Hannah. I don't know the scholarship at all. And so it's interesting to hear you say that there's a lot more on Australian forces than on New Zealand ones, and even though they fought together. Is that because the historians of New Zealand military are focusing on something else? Or, I mean, what explains that? And then also, could you just say quickly, the lethal injection thing is just horrifying and fascinating both. What's the attention been on that in particular so far?
To start with your second question first, the lethal injection finding was new. I came across it, I think last October. It was just like 10 o'clock at night. I emailed my advisor about it. I was like, have you seen this? And I knew it was kind of a bigger deal when he emailed me 5 minutes later, and then I was suddenly CC'd on 5 emails to all these scholars that I was currently reading. And then to address your first question, kind of in the wake of that answer, Australian POWs, their World War I prisoners of war, have been extensively written about, and their experience of captivity has been laid out day by day. We know the themes, we know what happens to these men. So to come across lethal injection in the New Zealand context was really surprising. There has not been similar literature done on New Zealand prisoners of war in terms of their experience, and it's been explained to me, and I kind of understand it, as Australia is a larger space. If you think about New Zealand on maps, it's often just too small to be included even on a map, so why would we be looking here? I don't have the exact numbers of Australian prisoners of war, but I know that they number in the thousands compared to New Zealand's 503, and then especially at Gallipoli, even less there. So just kind of overlooked in time, yeah, and there was this finding.
Just to build off of that, I don't know the participation numbers from New Zealand, especially in terms of like Maori participation. Do you think that could maybe play a factor? Like, so you mentioned that Indian prisoners of war were also subject to these injections. Do you think there could also just be a racial factor in if they were like Maori participants? I don't know.
That is a really fascinating question, and I want to preface my answer with I just have not done enough study, and as a scholar from Minnesota, I haven't had that experience yet. But in my understanding, so if you think about American context and with our indigenous people and Black Americans fighting in World War I, these were segregated units. In New Zealand, that segregation didn't exist. Maori were fighting alongside white soldiers up until the establishment of the Pioneer Battalion, which was entirely indigenous incorporated. But yeah, I'm going to say that my experience is limited. I would imagine that there was some racial element, but I also think that these prisoners were dying of dysentery, and the Ottomans were completely overwhelmed as well.
Sure.
A lot of scholarship could be done from so many different angles on this topic, and I think the research here has really just only begun.
My question was also about the Maori and Indigenous.
Did you, I know you didn't study Australia, but did you find any documentation of the same issues happening in the Australian prisoners?
In terms of evidence of lethal injection at Kiresuk, I've found 5 pieces of testimony. There's the 4 statements of New Zealand men, and then there is a book called In Captivity, which is, I can't remember which particular regiment of the Indian forces, but these prisoners of war, and they're unnamed in this book, they're just giving quotes, but they very clearly establish the same, they almost use the exact same language of an injection was given and then the subsequent time of death. There was some inconsistencies in how long it would take for the injection to kill a prisoner. Some said 2 hours, and then I think the longest was 24 hours, but it was always the same, and a lot of them also included descriptions of the color. It was a brandy-colored fluid. So it's the evidence is really strong that this was the same occurrence, and there just is such limited information. Just to add on that as like a personal note, I am hoping at some point to make it to Turkey, because Kiresuk has turned the prisoner of war camp into a museum, and I would really love to work with some of those scholars in my upcoming studies.
I have a question to each of the speakers. Hannah, would you say something about the work of the NZEF and what are they trying to do when they're compiling these testimonies? Matthew, if you would mind saying something about the French memory of Dragoon. And Ryken, if you have some thoughts about the relationship between history and commemoration as you're seeing it in von letsen khurbn.
Yeah, so to answer your question about the NZEF, the New Zealand Expeditionary Force, at this time, this is just the Army. This is Army officials that are collecting statements, they're collecting them. They say on the sheet of questions that I had up that this is explicitly for use of the military historian. So they are located now at Archives New Zealand in Wellington. And it's purely for documentation purposes.
The question about French memory is a very good question, and it's a very important element of the story that I did not have the minutes to include in my presentation, unfortunately. But it plays a big role in the French memory of the war, partially, I assume, because there is this contested idea of the French giving up, and especially in American culture, we're pretty guilty of that assumption. In the Riviera region, there are museums. The Museum of the Landing, I believe, is the direct translation of the museum. There are festivals and gatherings and celebrations on August 15th and thereabouts. And part of what makes as with all historical events, it's very nuanced. And one of the nuances that I unfortunately wasn't able to include in my presentation, but I did talk about a little bit in my paper, was the actual makeup of the French troops who did liberate Marseille and Toulon. They were, by and large, a majority were colonial troops, many of whom were forcefully conscripted. And that really, in the immediate post-war, there was this big push by Charles de Gaulle to elevate the Frenchness of the participation and hold up this part of history as an example of French glory, and in recent years that's really kind of become a lot more complicated with the recognition that a lot of the soldiers were there perhaps not by choice, and a lot of them were not fighting necessarily for France, but rather perhaps even for their own liberation or for under force. So it's a really complicated topic, and I wish that we had 20 minutes to talk.
Yeah, I think this history as commemoration is ever present in the journal, not in a positive light for whatever reason. When I think commemoration, maybe it's some sort of positive thing, but the importance of remembering this history is present in not only the content of the journal, but also the language of it. Throughout, there are introductions written by the editors throughout these kind of ads and blurbs that I mentioned too, that appear. The language that's used, it's described as a duty, as a kind of a duty of these survivors who at this point are stuck right now in Germany to donate what they have, to give what they have to remember this history, to build this archive that would remember this period in Jewish history. And so again, that's a larger goal of the commission, but von letsen khurbn served as kind of a platform to further that, and then again share what the commission was gathering. I should also mention that in the title of the journal itself, which I forgot to translate for you all, the loose translation that I settled on was from the latest extermination. And so there's also this connotation and this knowledge by Jews in Jewish history that this is one in a long line of attempts to exterminate Jews. And so you can see that in the language too, and in how this mission is described, that because this is one in a long line of efforts, the latest effort, that it's even more important for the survivors to step up, to donate what they have, as meaningless as it might seem, and then to read the journal and to learn the varied experience of what they survived.
I have a question for Ryken. I was curious if these journals were religious or culturally Jewish, or if it was a mix of both.
I don't see much religion brought up in there. Some of the language borders on religion. You can see allusions to a holy duty, but that might again just be kind of in this line of historical. attempts to exterminate Jews, which go back to biblical periods. But yeah, you can see this growing culture, this cultural language of we are a people, we are still a people, despite 6 million of us being killed by the Germans. We have survived this as a people, and we need to complete this documentation and read about it and educate it, not only for ourselves, but also especially for those that were lost. There's language in the journals too about the commission's work, the archive, and the journal itself serving as a tombstone for those who do not themselves have tombstones. And so not so much religious, but very cultural.
Yeah, I have a question for Matthew. Where did you first hear about the operation, and then was your immediate research interest in understanding why you have just heard about it, or were there different interests that you were thinking about taking an approach with?
That's also a really good question, and I was really hoping that no one would ask it. I actually don't remember where I first heard about it. I remember, there are some historical accounts, there's a YouTube channel that does every week of the war, they talk about a new element, and it's a fantastic source, but I may have heard of it from there. I'm not entirely sure. Like I said, I'm a big geek about World War II, and so it was gonna come up eventually.
You need to put that in the foreword of the book.
I visited the New Orleans National World War II Museum, and partially as a result of this research, and I wanted to learn more about the way that it's remembered, and it factors into my paper that when you get there, there's just a little placard, maybe this big, with one picture. And that's the biggest mention of Dragoon in the entire museum. And so I think it is something that if you dive deep into the topic, or if you are in circles, because the perspective that my research has taken has been rooted in the American experience. We think about, Overlord, we think about it in an American sense. You think about the French participation, and a lot of us think about it as they gave up, and that's a very much an American perspective. And so I think that continuing to research this, continuing to research the war, I was going to run across this eventually and kind of fall into the debated history about it and interpretation of the invasion. But I don't remember exactly where I first learned about it.
Yes.
I got a question for Matt. You made me think of this. What would be the next forgotten that you would write about?
I think one thing that I found very interesting was the Dieppe invasion, which was, I believe, 1942, and it was a Allied effort to land in Dieppe and test if they could land in a port, capture the port, and then get out. And it drew disproportionately on Canadian forces, and the Canadians suffered a lot as a result of it. There were something like 700 dead Canadians. And it's also a very important invasion because it led to some of the knowledge of how Overlord was carried out. The assumption that, can we land on a port and take a port? Well, they learned that the ports are going to be a little bit more heavily guarded and more difficult to take. And so in Overlord, they landed on beaches. So I think that that's an underappreciated element of both Canadian history and also just the war as a whole. So I'd probably start there.
Yes, we're done cooking.
We have,
I think this is for Ryken. I think you maybe mentioned it or at some time, but what happened to the journal? Why did it end in 48?
Yeah, so that's actually I see it as kind of a sad story.
Yeah.
So, of course, these DP camps were never meant to be permanent. They existed for many years. The last one that was operating in the American zone closed in 1957, but they were always meant to be transit spaces. And because people were stuck in them for so long because of bureaucracy and paperwork, they did take up societies of their own, but they were always meant to leave. And so 1948 saw a natural period when the editors, the main editors of the journal, Israel Kaplan and Moshe Feigenbaum, had the opportunity to leave, to emigrate to what was then Israel in 1948. And so I was able to read the last edition of the journal. There's going away pieces, there's editorial introductions, but there's also the hope of the Yad Vashem organization, which still exists today, in Israel as the world's foremost Holocaust remembrance organization. And in large part, Yad Vashem's archives were built out of the Central Historical Commission's archives that they collected in their short time. The tragedy of all of this is that when Kaplan and Feigenbaum moved to Israel hoping for jobs at Yad Vashem, they were turned away because they were seen as not having historical qualifications, even though they were both educators. The secondary research that I've done believes that it's because they were Yiddish historians, and at that point Hebrew was the mandated language in the state of Israel, and Yiddish was always considered a sort of slang language, but there's no confirmation.
So it just ended.
Yeah, so then it ended kind of as the camps were closing, and it may have gone on in Form and Yad Vashem possibly, but they were not offered positions.
I'm curious for Hannah and for Matthew, how you go about, like as a process question, how you go about studying forgetting, like as a project. How do you research a thing not being talked about enough? Because, which definitionally seems like limited resources.
I can start answering that. It's a good question as well, and I think that it's difficult because, you know, in my paper I have a hard time writing sometimes about newspapers because the newspapers don't cover something. And then I ask, do I cite the whole newspaper or do I cite the headline that isn't about what I'm researching, you know? And I think that I went through a couple different ways to kind of formulate my understanding of in what manner is it forgotten. For instance, I looked at the Man on the Mall interviews, which were interviews with surviving veterans of the war. And I looked through all of them, and I found tons from Overlord, I found some from Northern Africa, I found 2 from Dragoon. And so it is difficult to study something that doesn't exist, or rather to study the lack of something. But once you know about the something that many people don't know about, then you know where to start looking for where it should be. Like for instance in the National World War II Museum, and where you see not entirely an absence, but perhaps a twisted understanding of the narrative, or just an absence of the subject.
Wrong button. Okay. I think that to answer your question, the first place I started is in conversation. A lot of this research took place over the summer last year. I had the honor of spending a whole day with Christopher Pugsley and just really talking with him about it. And in encountering these big name military historians in New Zealand, which sounds like an oxymoron, but I promise it isn't. You know, the fact that they didn't know about it was meaningful, and just hearing them process through that information was also really helpful. And then what you said about museum exhibits, I also spent a lot of time in museums in small town New Zealand, and also in their major army museum. And again, there's just a whole floor dedicated to Gallipoli, and there is one plaque dedicated to prisoners of war, which is interesting. And then I think the final piece of the puzzle for me was the monuments. And I mean, these monuments are meticulous, and they are in every single small town across New Zealand, South Island, and the North Island as well. Just every town has a monument to World War I, and they all include the names of the fallen. And then there is just nothing written about those who returned or those who were prisoners, which is in contrast to Australia, where the names of everyone who served is featured on those memorials. So that's where I start for getting studies, I guess. And then if I could just add one little piece as I was thinking through your answers to questions about Indigenous people in my studies. And in that, these were all men from the South Island, which was entirely white men. There would not have been any Maori prisoners of war in Turkey at that time.
Just a comment for you, Hannah. As you talked about all of this, I am Hannah's mom. Incredibly proud of the work that we've done as everyone here. It's fun to see this. But as I look into healthcare, and you talked about how the prisoners would die a few hours after giving the medication, and I think of end-of-life care in healthcare and what we do for hospice patients. And so many times we give a medication, and that's an hour later they die because they've relapsed enough. So I'd be so curious to know what it is that they gave. to know, could this have been something that just allowed their dying body to give in and relax and go on?
You can't ask that kind of question at the big final presentation. Where was that months ago, years ago?
Interdisciplinary.
My graduate project is not this, I can't go back.
It's just a comment is all. Future research on that.
Well, that's the work of history, always asking the hard questions. Thank you so much for the panelists.
Maybe I can grab the mic as we, wow, this has been quite a day, and what a journey that these papers have taken us on, and I'm still, it's going to take me a long time to process this, and just to see the work of so many of you. I don't know all the projects from the beginning, but being able to watch how these have evolved over time and how poised and professional all of you were today was really, truly impressive. So I think maybe that deserves one more round of applause. Also, a few more words of thanks. David pointed out Andrea's work, but I want to point out in particular the work of our undergraduate advising team, Dr. David Perry, of course, Shannon, who is also a former major as well, and a winner of the Hedley Donovan Prize. So this is somebody who's really doing this as part of a passion as well, and great questions too, getting up and down and helping us work through this technology constantly, a lot of exercise there. Dory, who presented, but is also part of the sort of advising team too. So thank you for all of that. We've been here a long time. I'm going to just, I'd like just to sort of pass this on to my colleague and the chair of the history department. And again, I think we've alluded to the fact without her support, this would not have happened. This is technically a trial program. I hope that, when I'm long gone from the university, that this program will still be running, that we'll get to come back in 20 years. And it's what an opportunity, not only for a process to be able to develop and dedicate an entire year to one project like this. I don't know of any comparable program in the College of Liberal Arts, or perhaps the entire university, that does gives this type of opportunity for undergraduates. But there's also this concomitant journey, I'm sure that all of you went through, of sort of self-discovery too, of not knowing that you would be able to do what you guys just did. And that was very, very impressive. So again, I want to thank you all for that. I want to thank too the parents. I forgot to mention them. Parents and friends. Without your support and without the support of the cohort, it's great to see you here supporting each other, asking questions, and that there's a real sense of cohesion that I think we could palpably feel. So thank you for that. Let me ask my chair and my colleague, Sarah Chambers, just to say a few words in closing.
Thank you, Howard. Wow. I mean, really, this was an amazing day. Congratulations to all the distinguished scholars who have done all this research and then put together these amazing presentations and answered really difficult questions and brought this knowledge to us. It's been a wonderful day. It's been a long day, but for me, it's been a really energizing day to see this, and this is going to really carry me through the end of the semester, and I hope all of you as well. I was also going to thank everybody that Howard thanks, so I'll just say ditto to that, and we'll save a little time there. But I want to say, this was both about your individual accomplishments and the way in which oftentimes in history we spend a lot of quiet time alone, reading, trying to decipher maybe another language or some handwriting or an image, and what does the image mean. But I also want to pick up on the theme that we started with this morning, is that it's not only that it's also about a community of scholars that comes together, that learns from each other, that the questions enrich and send us back to our work to learn in new ways. And so I'm really glad that the course that started in the fall has been renamed a workshop, because this is really part of our intellectual culture here in the history department at the University of Minnesota. We have a lot of workshops that graduate students and faculty present their work in progress, their research, get feedback, have discussions, then go back to their work and continue to work on it. And it's so wonderful that we now also have that kind of a workshop for our wonderful historians who are getting their BAs in our department, or sister departments that also are doing historical work. I also want to say, that along those lines, you all ended with a sort of so what slide on your PowerPoints, and the so what was both about the significance of each of your sets of research, but I think the so what is also about the sharing out, right? That unlike maybe a class where you write a paper and your professor reads it and then you put it away, here you are sharing not only with each other over the course of the year, but then wonderful to have friends and mentors and graduate students that maybe you've worked with at some point, and of course family, and you're sharing out this knowledge. And I think that this theme that came up very strongly in this last panel, but actually was a theme throughout the whole day, of memory and forgetting. And what you are doing is making sure that we don't forget and that we recover these memories. And so I hope, and I want to pick up, not everybody was here when the dean opened up this morning. The dean is a literary scholar, but he revealed to us that he's a closet historian. I was very glad to hear that. And he said, we need historians everywhere. I could not agree more. We need historians everywhere. So as some of you will still be with us maybe for another semester, but many of you are heading out. Some of you are maybe going to be non-closet historians. But others of you, as you go into other fields, don't have to give up being historians. And you can carry that curiosity, but you can also carry that way of knowing that we develop as historians, and the sharing out of what we know and learn. And another theme from throughout the day, whether they were looking at sources from 2,000 years ago or from 20 years ago, was this complicated process of reading through the sources and sorting through what was the strategy behind these sources, what was the audience. That skill is more important than ever. That has been around in all sources and narratives produced about history, in human history, but now the sort of technology change has made it more urgent than ever, that we continue to not only rely on what we see on a screen or in a tweet, but to go back to recovering these memories. And so I really applaud that you've done that. So take that forth, but also please keep in touch. We are really so proud of you, and we hope that you will continue to let us know how you're doing, what you're doing, whether as open historians or closet historians. We want to hear about it. So thank you very much.